before napalm lit the jungles of Luzon or poured into the caves of Iwo Jima. It began in a quiet laboratory far from any battlefield. In 1942, as the war in the Pacific escalated, American planners faced a problem no bomb, artillery shell, or rifle bullet could solve. Japan's defensive style was unlike anything the United States had faced. Japanese troops hid in thick jungle that swallowed light. They built bunkers so deep that high explosive charges only shook the surface. They carved tunnels into mountains. They camouflaged sniper nests under layers of leaves and dirt until they became invisible from both ground and air. The U.S. needed something that did not just explode. It needed something that spread, clung, burned, and filled every corner of terrain that explosives could not reach. Out of that need came napalm, a weapon that would reshape the final year of the Pacific War. The development began at Harvard University, led by a team of chemists searching for a formula that would turn gasoline into a thick, sticky gel. Ordinary gasoline burned too quickly. It splashed and evaporated. What the military wanted was fire that could live, fire that crawled, fire that spread across ground, rock, wood, and leaves in a rolling wave, fire that could fill a cave or trench and burn long after the first ignition. The chemists combined gasoline with aluminum-based soaps to create a gel that clung to surfaces and burned fiercely. They called it napalm, a name taken from the chemicals naphthenate and palmitate that thickened the mixture. The first tests shocked the scientists. When ignited, napalm did not behave like any fuel fire they had seen before. It stuck to the ground and kept burning. It flowed like liquid, but ignited everything it touched. Even when spread across wet earth, napalm burned with a deep orange flame that resisted wind and rain. It produced intense heat that could penetrate bunkers and burn out oxygen inside enclosed spaces. What began as a scientific experiment quickly turned into a weapon the U.S. military recognized as a breakthrough. The timing could not have been more critical. In the jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, American forces were already struggling against Japanese soldiers who used the terrain as a shield. Artillery blasts tore through branches and leaves, but rarely reached the bunkers below. Infantry attacks cost dozens of men for every few yards gained. Units advancing uphill faced fire from foxholes dug so deep that grenades could not reach the defenders. The Pacific was turning into a war of attrition against an enemy who refused to fight out in the open. Commanders needed a way to break these positions without sacrificing entire platoons. That was when napalm earned its place in the arsenal. The early versions were packed into metal tanks that could be dropped from aircraft or fired from flamethrower vehicles. Bombs such as the M47 and later the M74 became standard carriers for napalm mixtures. When these bombs burst, the gel splashed outward and ignited instantly, covering wide areas with fire. For the first time, American forces had a weapon that could reach inside the jungle canopy, crawl over rocks and roots, and burn through every hiding place beneath. The concept was simple. If an enemy refused to leave his bunker, burn the bunker until he had no choice. Yet napalm was not just about destruction. Its true power lay in its ability to reshape the battlefield. Fire cleared vegetation faster than bulldozers. It exposed snipers hiding in the trees. It stripped camouflage from machine gun nests. It opened paths for infantry and armor where none had existed. It demolished wooden fortifications in seconds, denying the enemy the time to regroup or relocate. It did what explosives could not. It removed the environment as a defensive advantage. Before napalm entered combat, commanders debated whether the weapon would be effective on Pacific terrain. Some worried the thick jungle moisture would smother flames. Others questioned how well napalm would spread through uneven terrain. but every doubt vanished during the first field demonstrations. Observers watched fires climb trees, leap across underbrush, and burn out entire hillsides. They watched the gel seep into foxholes and ignite the ground inside. They saw how napalm denied defenders the ability to hide, forcing them into open ground where infantry could engage them directly. By 1944, napalm was being produced in large quantities. Hundreds of thousands of gallons were stored in drums and loaded into bombs across bases in the Pacific. It became part of a new doctrine that emphasized close air support in terrain where enemy defenses blended seamlessly with the landscape. Aircraft such as the F-4U Corsair, P-51D Mustang, and B-25 Mitchell began carrying napalm tanks beneath their wings. Pilots trained to skim treetops, release their payloads, and let the fire roll downhill into Japanese positions. Each mission brought new evidence that the weapon was transforming the tempo of battle. The psychological impact was immense. American troops witnessing napalm for the first time described it as a wave of living fire. It roared across the ground, sending sparks and flames twisting into the air. It burned with a depth and persistence that frightened even those who used it. Many Marines wrote that the battlefield changed the moment napalm arrived. The jungle no longer felt impenetrable. The hills no longer felt invincible. Japanese positions that had resisted artillery and bombs for days crumbled within minutes under the onslaught of burning gel. For Japanese soldiers, the shock was far greater. Their defensive doctrine relied on fixed positions hidden inside caves, behind ridges, or under dense vegetation. They were prepared for explosives, infantry, tanks, and artillery. But they were not prepared for fire that poured like water, slid down cave walls, and burned the oxygen inside tunnels. Napalm did not need to break through thick concrete. It only needed to reach the entrance. Once inside, it consumed everything. Part 1 ends with a scene that would repeat across the Pacific. An American pilot circles overhead, watching a line of napalm flames spread through the jungle below. What was once a fortress of shadows and movement becomes a clearing of scorched earth. Beneath him, infantry advance into ground that moments earlier had been deadly. The Pacific War is shifting, bit by bit, as a new weapon begins to change the rhythm of battle. The fire has arrived, and everything it touches will change. When American forces returned to the Philippines in late 1944, they stepped into a world shaped for defense and death. Luzon and Leyte were islands of ridges, ravines, thick brush, tall grass, and forests so dense that even sunlight struggled to break through. The Japanese defenders had turned this natural chaos into a fortress. They dug hundreds of foxholes under roots. They carved firing slits into the bases of trees. They hid machine gun nests behind walls of bamboo and palm leaves. They rigged entire hillsides with concealed trenches, each one connected to another through narrow tunnels. Every step forward for American infantry felt like walking into an ambush. Artillery could clear sections of jungle, but only in narrow strips. Bombs could pound a ridge, but Japanese troops simply waited in deep dugouts until the explosions stopped. Grenades rolled off jungle slopes or bounced uselessly against thick foliage. The enemy fired from invisible angles, from brush so thick that riflemen could not even see the muzzle flashes. The fighting was slow, brutal, and exhausting. American commanders realized that if they fought this battle with ordinary weapons, they would bleed for every inch of ground. Then, napalm arrived. By the time the liberation of the Philippines began, napalm had already proven effective in controlled tests, but the islands provided the first chance to use it in large-scale combat. Loaded in cylindrical tanks beneath the wings of F-4U Corsairs and P-51D Mustangs, napalm bombs became the tip of the spear for ground troops, advancing through nearly impenetrable terrain. Pilots flew low along treetops, picked out suspected strongpoints, and released their tanks. When the containers burst, the gel spread outward in wide sheets.
Moments later, entire sections of jungle ignited in rolling waves of orange flame. The effect was immediate. Thick undergrowth, once impossible to clear quickly, burned away in seconds. Roots, vines, leaves, and overhead canopies folded into ash. Hidden trenches were uncovered. Camouflaged firing pits turned into open craters. The flames exposed the enemy's positions with a clarity no scout plane could provide. In many cases, Japanese soldiers fled their bunkers as the fire approached, diving from their positions and running across open ground where American infantry or tanks cut them down. One Marine described napalm as a curtain of fire that pulled the jungle back like a stage backdrop, revealing everything the Japanese had been hiding. Leyte offered the first dramatic example. American infantry advancing into the Ormoc Valley found themselves pinned down by unseen snipers firing from tree lines hundreds of yards away. Tanks could not advance through the muddy slopes. Patrols disappeared into the brush and came back with casualties, but no answers. Then a squadron of corsairs dropped napalm tanks along the ridge. Flames crawled up the hillside like liquid lightning. Within seconds, the dense undergrowth became a blackened skeleton of charred trunks. The sniper fire stopped. When infantry moved in afterward, they found abandoned rifles, empty helmets, and half-burned positions that had been invisible only minutes before. On Luzon, the terrain was even more punishing, with ridges rising sharply from the valley floors. Japanese defenders used these slopes to create a network of overlapping fields of fire. Every climb became a gauntlet. Units advancing uphill sometimes suffered dozens of casualties before reaching the crest. After several costly attempts, commanders shifted strategy. Instead of sending infantry up the slopes first, they sent napalm. Pilots lined up their approach runs, sometimes flying so low that the tops of palm trees brushed their wings. They dropped napalm tanks in long arcs, letting the gel slide downhill like a burning river. The fire crept into bamboo thickets and ravines, igniting ammunition caches, cooking off grenades, and burning oxygen inside shallow dugouts. When infantry followed, the ridges that had once resisted them for days had turned into silent, smoldering paths. Japanese units that survived the flames were disoriented, dehydrated, and forced to retreat from positions they had prepared for months. Perhaps the most dramatic impact of napalm in the Philippines was its ability to neutralize Japanese anti-tank defenses. The enemy frequently placed concealed anti-tank guns behind thick brush, firing on Shermans only when they had moved too far to reverse. Napalm flipped this tactic on its head. When napalm burned away the cover, the guns were revealed long before they could fire. Tanks rolled forward with confidence, aware that their deadly ambushers were exposed. Fuel dumps also became prime targets. Japanese forces in the Philippines relied heavily on small fuel storage sites hidden under canopies of trees. These sites were nearly impossible for bombers to hit from high altitude, but Corsairs and Mustangs swooped in low, dropped napalm directly onto the foliage, and turned entire fuel dumps into roaring infernos. The explosions that followed shook valleys and darkened the sky with thick black smoke. Without fuel, Japanese units could not maneuver, resupply, or conduct counterattacks. Fire had severed the lifelines of entire battalions. American infantry quickly grew to appreciate the power napalm gave them. They watched hills that had cost dozens of lives fall in minutes. They marched into clearings where sniper fire had once been constant. They advanced behind tank columns that no longer feared ambush from hidden positions. Many soldiers wrote that the moment napalm went in, the battlefield changed. The invisible enemy became visible. The jungle lost its ability to hide death. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was equally powerful. Their doctrine emphasized fighting from concealed positions, using the terrain as a shield. But napalm removed the shield. It burned away camouflage, collapsed timber ceilings, and filled dugouts with fumes that forced the defenders out. Many Japanese soldiers, trained to fight to the death, tried to hold their positions, but could not withstand the heat that surged into their hiding places. They often emerged choking and blinded, only to be captured or cut down by advancing troops. Part 2 ends with an image that came to define the Philippine campaign. A hillside once hidden behind a wall of green now lies stripped bare. blackened and smoking. At its base, American infantry advance cautiously, rifles raised, stepping over scorched earth. Above them, the fading roar of aircraft engines marks the departure of corsairs that delivered the napalm strike. The jungle no longer belongs to the defenders. Fire has taken it, clearing the way for the army that has returned to reclaim the islands. The Philippines is changing, and with it, the course of the Pacific War.
When American forces landed on Iwo Jima in February 1945, they walked into a battlefield unlike any other in the Pacific. There were no jungles to burn away, no thick forests to clear. Instead, the island was a wasteland of volcanic ash, jagged rock, sulfur pits, and black sand that swallowed boots with every step. It was a place shaped not by nature, but by Japan's most determined engineers. Beneath the surface lay a labyrinth of tunnels more than 18 kilometers long. These tunnels connected bunkers, machine gun nests, mortar pits, command posts, medical stations, and living quarters. Some tunnels had multiple levels. Many stretched deep inside Mount Suribachi. The Japanese garrison could fight for weeks underground, immune to bombs, artillery, and naval gunfire. The Americans knew the battle would be brutal. What they did not know was that napalm would become one of the only weapons capable of shaking the foundations of the island's underground defenses. When the Marines first tried to storm the volcanic ridges, they were met with bursts of machine gun fire from holes so small they were invisible until the muzzle flashes appeared. Mortar rounds dropped from positions hidden inside cave mouths. Rifle shots came from cracks in the rock, from vents barely the size of a fist. High explosive shells shattered against the stone, sending dust and fragments into the air, but leaving the tunnels untouched. Even when bombs collapsed the entrances, Japanese soldiers simply carved new exits during the night. Iwo Jima, more than any other battlefield, taught the United States that explosives alone could not defeat an enemy buried inside the earth. That was when napalm became the weapon of choice. Unlike conventional bombs, napalm did not need to penetrate deep underground. It only needed to enter the openings. The gel flowed like thick liquid, clinging to stone walls, pooling on floors, and burning with an intensity that consumed the oxygen inside enclosed spaces. Fire rolled into the caves in slow waves, igniting ammunition, timber supports, and fabric. The heat expanded through the tunnels, forcing the defenders out or suffocating them where they hid. Before each major push, aircraft flew low passes over the island, dropping napalm tanks against cave openings and suspected tunnel systems. The gel splashed outward and flowed into cracks. When ignited, it created curtains of fire that blocked movement and forced the defenders deeper underground. Pilots flying Corsairs and Avengers described watching flames crawl like live creatures along the rocky slopes, entering gaps that no bomb could reach. The Marines on the ground soon witnessed the effect firsthand. When infantry approached a ridge that had resisted them for days, flamethrower tanks rolled forward. These were modified Shermans fitted with the Navy's Mark I and later the RNRH Ronson flamethrower system. They fired streams of napalm-based fuel that reached more than 100 yards. The flames curved into cave mouths, turning darkness into roaring orange light. Screams echoed from inside the tunnels. When the fire subsided, Marines advanced, cautiously, weapons raised, only to find positions that had once held dozens of soldiers, now abandoned or silent. The Japanese defenders knew what was happening. Their entire strategy depended on staying hidden underground, waiting for the enemy to come close, then launching ambushes. Napalm shattered that strategy. It forced them out into the open, where American rifles, machine guns, and tanks waited. The defenders attempted countermeasures. They built stone walls inside caves to block the flames. They created air pockets deep underground. They tried covering entrances with metal sheets or wet blankets. But napalm burned too hot and too aggressively. The gel clung to metal and burned through cloth. It dripped over walls and flowed to cracks. Even soldiers who survived the first blast often emerged gasping for air, disoriented and blinded. One Marine platoon reported clearing a ridge that had held them back for nearly 2 days. They had taken heavy casualties from snipers firing through tiny slits in the rock.
No amount of grenades or rifle fire could dislodge the defenders. Then a Sherman flamethrower arrived. The tank fired 2 long streams of napalm into the main entrance. Flames surged. Inside, minutes later, the firing stopped completely. When the Marines moved in, they found the entire position neutralized. For the first time in the battle, they felt they had seized ground without losing dozens of men to unseen guns. On the slopes leading to Suribachi, napalm played an even bigger role. Aircraft targeted the mountain's outer tunnels, burning through brush and rock crevices that hid firing positions. Fires burned for so long that the black volcanic sand fused in the glass-like patches. When infantry advanced, they found cave entrances melted shut by intense heat. In some areas, the flames revealed hidden vents that allowed Japanese soldiers to fire from multiple angles. Once exposed, these vents were closed permanently with demolitions and flamethrowers. The psychological effect on Japanese troops was severe. Their doctrine taught them to endure artillery, bombs, and naval fire. They trained to resist shockwaves, to survive cave collapses, and to wait out bombardments. But no one trained for fire that flowed like water, clung to skin, and consumed oxygen. Napalm removed the advantage of endurance. It made concealment meaningless. It turned fixed positions into death traps. For the Marines, napalm meant progress. It meant clearing a position in minutes instead of hours. It meant fewer frontal assaults across open ground. It meant saving lives. Many wrote in their journals that without napalm, the battle for Iwo Jima could have taken twice as long and cost thousands more lives. One Marine sergeant summed it up simply in a letter home. The flamethrowers and bombs broke the island. Nothing else could touch those caves. Part 3 ends with an image etched into the memory of every man who fought on that island. The black slopes of Iwo Jima glow with patches of fire. Smoke rises from cave mouths as Marines advance cautiously behind the flames. The air smells of sulfur and burning fuel. In the distance, the silhouette of Mount Suribachi stands against the sky, its tunnels battered, its defenders weakened. The island is beginning to fall, not under bombardment or brute force, but under fire that reaches where no explosive ever could. The fire that changed the Pacific is now carving its path through Iwo Jima. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its most brutal and unforgiving stage. Okinawa was the final stepping stone to Japan itself, the last and strongest defensive bastion the Imperial Army had prepared outside the home islands. Unlike Iwo Jima's volcanic tunnels or Luzon's jungles, Okinawa combined the worst of both worlds. It had deep natural caves, limestone ridges, thick vegetation, and a defensive system so carefully engineered that American commanders called it a fortress the size of an island. At the center of that fortress lay the Shuri Line, a mile-deep network of interlocking bunkers, reverse-slope positions, anti-tank trenches, machine gun webs, artillery dugouts, and honeycombed caves stretching from coast to coast. The Japanese intended to bleed the Americans white. Every ridge was a trap, every hill was a kill zone, every cave was a bunker that could be defended for days. Artillery tubing was camouflaged beneath layers of dirt and leaves. Sniper nests were hidden behind carefully arranged vegetation that blended perfectly with the terrain. Nothing visible was ever the real position. Everything visible was bait. Artillery could hit the ridges. Naval guns could blast holes into the limestone. Aircraft could drop high explosives. But nothing could reach into the tunnels and narrow slits that dotted the Shuri Line. Every time American troops cleared one ridge, another ridge behind it opened fire. Every cave destroyed revealed 3 more. The Japanese had dug themselves into the earth in a way that no bomb could fully penetrate. Then came napalm. Okinawa was the battlefield where napalm reached its fullest destructive potential. Unlike Iwo Jima, where napalm was used primarily to burn out caves, the weapon on Okinawa was used as a system-wide solution to an island-scale problem. Napalm did not just destroy Japanese positions, it reshaped the battlefield itself. The first major use came when Marines advancing along the southern ridges realized they were fighting ghosts. Every time they took a position, fire opened up from behind them. Japanese troops moved through tunnels like water through pipes, appearing and disappearing at will. Napalm was used to seal and deny these tunnels. Aircraft flew low over the ridges, releasing napalm tanks that splashed burning gel into vents, cracks, and loopholes. The gel flowed downward, following the natural slope, burning through vegetation and rolling into the openings of the tunnel network. Marines on the ground followed behind the flames, closing the entrances with demolition charges while the defenders were still trapped inside. The vegetation itself was a greater enemy than the Japanese at times. On Okinawa, grass grew tall enough to conceal entire companies. Shrubs and low forests allowed snipers to fire from 20 yards away without being seen. Napalm stripped that away. When Corsairs or Hellcats released their payloads, the flames leached into the undergrowth and burned it down to black soil. The ridges that once erupted with hidden fire suddenly became visible. Infantry squads moved more confidently, knowing that the ground ahead was no longer a maze of concealment. The Japanese sniper threat, one of the deadliest elements of the battle, collapsed under napalm's assault. Snipers hid in trees, behind caves, or inside shallow pits camouflaged with brush exposed all of it. Flames licked up tree trunks, roots caught fire, leaves curled into smoke. Many snipers were forced to flee or die where they lay hidden. For the first time since the landings, American troops could walk open terrain without being shot at from invisible positions. Napalm also destroyed the intricate Japanese logistics system hidden under the ridges. The Shuri line depended on dozens of small fuel deposits, ammo caches, water reservoirs, and command posts buried deep inside the limestone. These were nearly impossible to destroy with conventional bombs because most were positioned far enough inside the rock to survive indirect hits. But napalm attacked their entrances. When the gel burned through wooden supports and ropes soaked in oil or sweat, the internal stores ignited. Entire cave complexes erupted in rolling waves of fire from within. Japanese units, already starving and dehydrated, suddenly found themselves unable to sustain prolonged resistance. Their ammunition cooked off, their water boiled, their shelters filled with smoke. American engineers and tank crews often coordinated napalm strikes with direct assaults. Sherman tanks equipped with flamethrowers led infantry forward. When they encountered a new ridge, they held position until aircraft arrived. The tanks then sprayed the lower slopes while Corsairs dropped napalm along the top ridge, creating a pincer of fire. Smoke poured into the sky. Cave openings glowed like furnace mouths. When the flames died down, infantry advanced into positions that had been nearly insurmountable hours earlier. The Japanese commanders understood the implication. Their greatest advantage, the terrain itself, had been stolen from them. They could no longer hide. They could no longer lure the Americans into kill zones. They could no longer depend on the eternal darkness of caves. Napalm turned darkness into light, camouflage into ash, and stone into fire. By late May, the Shuri line began to collapse. Not because the defenders were unwilling, but because the fire had eaten through their ability to endure. Their ammunition stores were gone, their water sources dried up, their tunnels filled with suffocating smoke. Many defenders emerged wildly, their faces blackened, their uniforms burned, clutching weapons that no longer fired cleanly. Some tried to counterattack, but most were cut down as soon as they left their positions. For the first time in months, American troops could advance without immediately encountering new hidden fortifications. Historians later wrote that the fall of the Shuri line was not just a battle won, it was a system destroyed. The Japanese defensive method, perfected through years of fighting, fell apart the moment napalm stripped away the terrain and exposed the core of the defensive network. Fire had broken what explosives could not. The island had begun to fall. When the smoke of Okinawa finally settled and the Pacific campaign moved into its final months, American commanders began to understand what had truly happened on the battlefields of 1944 and 1945. Napalm had not merely burned jungle, caves, bunkers, and vegetation. It had broken the core of Japan's defensive doctrine. Fire accomplished what steel alone could not. It denied concealment, suffocated tunnel systems, exposed snipers, destroyed fuel and ammunition stores, and forced defenders from positions they would otherwise have held for weeks. In the end, napalm reshaped the final year of the war and accelerated the collapse of an empire determined to fight to the last man. The impact was clearest in the personal accounts left behind by American Marines, soldiers, and pilots. Many infantrymen confessed that before napalm, the terrain itself felt like an enemy. The jungle hid death. The ridges hid snipers. The caves hid entire battalions. Every yard gained felt like a gamble. Napalm changed that. It removed the jungle's ability to protect the defenders. It stripped away the camouflage that had made the Pacific War one of ambush and invisibility. When napalm burned through a hillside or poured into a ravine, the Marines could finally see the battlefield instead of guessing where danger waited. One Marine wrote simply, "The fire gave us vision." Before that, the enemy could see us, but we could not see them. Another wrote, "We did not cheer napalm, but we knew it saved our lives every time it went in." Pilots too left haunting accounts. Many remembered flying low over ridges as napalm tanks detached from their wings. They watched the gel spill across slopes, then ignite in rolling waves that crawled uphill and downhill alike. They saw forests collapse into black ash. They saw fire push into cave mouths like a living creature. They saw hidden machine gun nests erupt into flame. Some pilots wrote that napalm was the only moment in the war when they understood the full meaning of the weapon they carried. One Corsair pilot said, "You see the flame catch, and you know no one inside that ridge wants to stay there." Japanese survivors later confessed that napalm was the one weapon they feared above all others. They trained to endure artillery. They rehearsed for bombs. They learned to survive cave collapses. They mastered the techniques of ambush and concealment. But napalm robbed them of every advantage. It burned away their camouflage. It flooded their firing positions with heat. It suffocated them in tunnels. It collapsed the oxygen in entire cave systems. Many could not see or breathe when napalm rolled in. Their morale collapsed long before their bodies failed. One Japanese officer later wrote, "We could endure hunger. We could endure fire from guns. But when the fire came down the hills, nothing endured." Historians looking back recognize that the introduction of napalm marked a turning point in the Pacific War, not because of its destructiveness alone, but because of what it did to the battlefield environment. The Pacific had always favored defenders. Every ridge, every valley, every tree, and every cave was a weapon for those who knew how to hide within it. American infantry often described feeling like they were fighting ghosts, invisible enemies waiting in impossible places. Napalm tore the veil away. The jungle that once hid the ambush became open ground. The tunnels that once held entire companies became ovens of suffocating heat. The ridges that once repelled assault after assault became silent, burned slopes that infantry climbed with far fewer casualties. Napalm also accelerated the end of Japanese resistance. Entire defensive networks collapsed under sustained napalm fire. Fuel dumps that were supposed to supply weeks of operations vanished in minutes. Ammunition caches detonated in spectacular chain reactions. Command posts buried deep underground filled with smoke and heat, forcing officers to surface and abandon their posts. The collapse of Japanese logistics on Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa can be traced directly to napalm strikes that destroyed hidden supply nodes no explosive could reach. But perhaps napalm's greatest legacy was in shaping post-war doctrine. It showed military strategists that battlefield denial through fire was a viable tactic. It established the foundation for modern close-air support, where aircraft could work directly with ground forces to destroy concealed threats. It demonstrated that terrain could be reshaped, cleared, or neutralized by weapons designed not merely to explode, but to transform the environment itself. Napalm became the precursor to a new era of warfare, where visibility, mobility, and environmental control became central objectives. As the war neared its end, American troops fighting on Okinawa looked out over hills once covered in green and now reduced to blackened scars. They understood that the fire had changed everything. Many knew they were standing on the last major battlefield before reaching the Japanese mainland. They also knew that without napalm, the campaign might have lasted months longer and cost tens of thousands more American and Japanese lives. Fire broke the enemy's final defensive lines, but it also broke the momentum of a strategy Japan had relied on since the earliest battles of the Pacific War. Part 5 ends with a quiet image that captures napalm's legacy. A Marine stands on a ridge overlooking the charred remains of what had once been dense forest. Smoke rises in thin white trails. The sky glows faintly as evening approaches. In the distance, the last fires of the battle burn low inside caves and hollows. The Marine lifts his helmet and wipes soot from his face. He does not celebrate. He simply understands. The fire has done its work. It opened the path to victory, changed the map of the Pacific, and ended the ability of Japan to fight from the shadows. The war is not over yet, but the last defensive walls have fallen. The fire has changed everything.